Thank you so much, Rosie. Thank you so much to all of you for being here tonight. It is a perfect English summer's evening out there, so you really have given up something. I'm very, very glad that you are all here. I wish I wasn't here, and I tell you why, because I am a very, very poor substitute for Socrates himself. And Socrates would have loved this evening. This is exactly his kind of thing. And I tell you why. He would have loved it because he loved to drink. He famously drank all his colleagues under the table. He loved beautiful women. He also loved beautiful men, and there are many of those here this evening, I'm very pleased to see. He also, very importantly, loved to talk. For him, meeting in a room and sharing ideas and talking face to face was the single most important thing that a man or a woman could do. Socrates had an allergy to the written word. He hated the idea of writing things down, but he thought that we should do this the whole time, that we should get up together and share ideas in dialogue. It's very interesting, actually, why he was so anxious about the written word, because he, as you all know, I'll just give you his dates, but I'm sure you all know this anyway. He was born in 469 BC, died in 399 BC. So he lives in the 5th century, in the moment that we describe as the Greek miracle, as the golden age of Athens, this extraordinary time when demos kratia, democracy itself, is born. This moment where men decide that they can rule and be ruled in turn, that every male citizen, and of course there is, for a female historian writing about this time, this slightly uncomfortable historical fact that women in Socrates' Athens were very much second-class citizens and not only couldn't vote and talk in the assembly, but also couldn't even eat the same rations as men. They generally weren't allowed out during daylight hours. They weren't allowed to own money. So this was not a feminist utopia by any means. However, it was a long time ago, so we can forgive them for that. But for the men of Athens, this was a really extraordinary time. And because it was a democracy, because people were having ideas together and sharing them, for the first time really in human history, writing had to be everywhere. People had to publish the ideas and the decisions that were taken in the democratic assembly. So when we think of Athens, I think the image that we have in our mind is this sort of rather beautiful place with lots of columns and monumental statues and wonderful temples. But actually, we should think of it as a place filled with writing everywhere, like all on stone stele, painted in red paint on the walls. So it would have been like a kind of a sort of cemetery, a kind of tombstone with these stone rectangles with writing everywhere. But Socrates saw the problem with writing before it became a problem in society. He saw that the issue with writing is that it cannot truly be debated, that once something is set down in his time, actually in stone, it is very, very hard to nuance it. He wrote that when words are bandied around or shared about, when they are reviled, they always need their father to protect them, meaning they always need their author to actually explain what was going on. And I think we all understand that. I mean, how many people, I have certainly done this, how many of you have sent an email intending one thing and had a horrified, offended, maybe even a lawyer's letter back saying, how dare you, affront me with this. And actually, it's not what you meant at all, but that is the problem with writing. And Socrates, as I said, he saw us coming in many ways. And I think that is his absolute genius, that when he thinks, when he speaks, he's not thinking about his own age, he's actually thinking about ours. He's not talking about the meaning of life, but the meaning of our own lives. So when journalists say to me, which they always do, I'm sure there are journalists in the room and I'm tempting fate now, please journalists think up an original question, because when I came up with this book, the first thing everybody said to me, of course, was, so why is Socrates relevant today? As Rosie said, he's a dead, white, bearded man. What does he have to say to the 21st century? And I have to say, I think the question actually should be, how is he not relevant to today? Because there is so much that Socrates says that actually explains our world. He was living at a time of extraordinary materialism. And for the first time, really, people were living the good life as we generally understand it. They were drinking, they were whoring, Athens enjoyed a huge empire. It looked like the good times were never going to stop. And Socrates says, what is the point of all of this? What's the point of glittering statues and beautiful warships and wonderfully constructed city walls if those within the city walls aren't happy? What is the point of living unless we live a good and a happy life? He also, very perceptively, saw that this wonderful, new, brave idea, democracy, could be flawed. He said democracy is a good thing. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but it isn't a magic wand. You don't come up with the word democracy and assume that this is going to be a panacea for the world's ills. And he was living, of course, at a time when Athens was sending out warships, fighting under the banner of democracy for the first time. I mean, this was real gunboat diplomacy. So Socrates saw these warships going into other harbours and saying, you will be democrats. This is a good thing to be. And he realised that this is something that would have problems. And indeed, Athens' empire fell. So in a way, again, he sees the geopolitical situation that we live in today. I'm going to tell you why I think he's particularly relevant today, but I just have to share with you I've just suddenly remembered this, a kind of wonderful journalist's question that I had today, because I've written a lot about Sparta and the Spartans. And I had an American journalist who emailed me to do an interview for one of the American magazines, and he said, actually, can I do an American accent? How many Americans are there in the room? Okay, can I just offend everybody on that side? Try doing American, which will be terrible. So this guy in his email said, hi, Bettany, we're a great fan of your work, and I'm really sorry, and we really love the Spartans and what you say about the Spartans. What I'd really like to know is what impact did the Huguenots have on Spartan culture? And it did take me a moment, so I thought, Anyways, very politely, I emailed back and said, fantastic, list of questions. Number 5, the impact of Huguenots on Spartan culture. I don't think I've really got anything intelligent to say about that. Anyway, and immediately it came back, oh, thanks, Bettany, but we're really particularly interested in your answer to question 5. And I suddenly realised what had probably happened, actually, is that in the Spartan age, there were these men called helots who were slaves. It was a whole race of slaves. So I think probably he probably typed in helots, but the spell check on his computer had changed it to Huguenots. Anyway, so poor man. I sent him away with a little mini flea in his ear. Sorry, back to Socrates and why he's so brilliant. So Socrates, as I said, I think that he speaks not of his world, but of her own. And I tell you why particularly. With his most famous aphorism, the unexamined life is not worth living for a man. He gives us the modern world because he comes from an age where tradition and convention and ritual is everything. But he says, actually, if we are to explore the world, that is something which is not seditious, it is essential to the human condition. So Socrates, I really do think, has given us the world that we live in today. So he is a brilliant subject. He is, however, a very, 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 very difficult subject to write about because Socrates himself, because he didn't like writing, wrote, as far as we know, not a word down. And for the historian, who generally, as you know, looks at historical texts and then reinterprets them, that makes him a bit of a challenge. And I did wonder why I'd taken on this task of writing about Socrates and was kind of thinking, gosh, have I done the right thing? And went up to Edinburgh to one of these literary festivals and was having breakfast with an author who will remain nameless, but a very famous author, and we were just sort of making conversation over the breakfast table. And he said, so what's your book? What are you writing now? I said, well, I'm doing this book on Socrates. And he said, oh, that's fantastic, that's brilliant. What an amazing donut subject, because it's really rich and satisfying with a great hole in the middle where the central character should be. And I just, a ring donut, of course, not a jam donut. And I just felt my smile freeze on my lips. And I thought, he's right. I am writing a book about a donut. And for the following decade, as I was typing away, I had this sort of spectral donut hovering over my shoulder. But I think it is possible to write a life of Socrates. Not only important because he is so important, but I think it is possible. And I'll tell you why. is because actually he came from a world where, as I said, writing was a new thing, where people expressed themselves much more sensually, much more physically, much more materially. So actually, if you look at the material evidence of Socrates' world, then you are likely to be able to begin to jigsaw puzzle together a true picture of him. Again, if there are any painters, so we've got the Americans over there, are there any painters in the room? One painter. There must be more. So I don't know if you agree with this. Somebody once told me that as an artist, to get the very best image of any kind of an object, you don't paint the object itself, you paint the space around the whole. And that is how you can begin to approach what that object is. So in a way, that's what I've had to do with Socrates. So why we've put this up, it's not just a plug for my book, because I got a very stern note saying no notes, no plugs for the book. So forget the writing. But if you look at the picture, this is obviously a 19th century version of Socrates' life. But in a way, actually, in that picture, this is the kind of evidence that we can use to piece together Socrates' story, particularly the people around him. Because for Socrates, people were everything. They were his magnetic north. He wandered through the streets of Athens talking constantly to anybody who would listen to him. He believed that the only point of living life was to have a relationship, as I said at the beginning, with those around you, to share ideas with those around you. So if you look at the men around and women around Socrates, then in a way you can start to piece together his story. And also, if you look at the stuff, all the bits and pieces in that beautiful place that was 5th century Athens, and why I think it's so important to look at the stuff in 5th century Athens, not just at the hype, because they were very good at their own PR, the Athenians. They told us they were brilliant and wonderful and violet-crowned, and we have believed them for 2,500 years. If you look at the stuff that's coming out of the ground, you realize that actually the world that Socrates lived in was in many ways a very bad world. And I think that's why he devoted his life to the search for the good. I'm just going to give you 3 examples, so I know we're up against time, but just 3 examples. Start off with slightly, bizarrely perhaps, a frying pan. Now, frying pans aren't inherently bad, I know, but there are many, many frying pans that are coming out of the digs of 5th century Athens at the moment. There's a very beautiful one. If you go to the new archaeological museum, it's kind of got pride of place at the front. And the reason that frying pans are important is that they immediately paint a different image of this wonderful city that we all have in our heads as this kind of pristine, perfect, pastel-coloured, gorgeous place. Athens was really, really stinky. It smelt worse than London in the 19th century. It was full of shit and horse crap and vomit from the symposia and the smell of slightly rotten frying fish. The Athenians were very keen on their frying fish. So just sort of hold that picture in your mind, just as a kind of, little nuance to the Socrates story. So there's the smell of frying fish, there's smoke from frying fish everywhere in Athens. Also the smoke from sacrifices, because the Athenians were brilliant and forward-thinking and rational and all those things, and also actually deeply superstitious. In a way, they had one foot in the modern world, one foot very firmly rooted in the Stone Age. So you would have goats' tongues being cut out. You'd have maidens piercing the hearts of doves and watching the blood seep onto altars. You'd have the sacrifice of fully grown animals. You'd have anything, any household object that could be burnt would be burnt on an altar. So the pollution in 5th century Athens was terrible. I mean, there would have been a terrible thick smog over the city. Socrates himself, just as an aside, on the day that he was tried, because it was a religious trial, the man trying him, sort of overseeing the trial, would have sacrificed an animal, filled the bowl underneath the animal with blood, and he would have plunged his hands in the bloody bowl up to his wrists. So you can imagine the trial of this extraordinary genius man, this philosopher, this man that we think of as one of the most stunning and original minds, was tried by a man who was elbow deep in blood. So it's a bloody place, it's a smelly place. It was also a place that had suffered deeply. And one of the things that's coming up again and again in the digs of Athens at the moment are human bones. There's a particular, very poignant, I know that's misused the word poignant, but it doesn't smell, but it's a very lovely skull of a little girl who died in the plague in Athens, because When Socrates lived, the city ended up being decimated, and we overuse the word decimated, but it started off with an Athenian body of 200,000, finished with an Athenian body of 20,000, because so many of those great Athenian men and women had died through battle, through civil strife, because there was a time when the democracy was voted out and death squads roamed the streets, and also through plague. So Socrates lived, as I said, in a very bad and a very difficult world, and I think that is why he was searching for the good life. But I don't want to finish on a morbid note. I've just been given the notes. I've got 1 minute to go. Socrates would not have wanted me to dwell on the difficulties of life. And even though he himself was put to death by a democratic court for speaking his mind freely, and this was a court that, remember, was supposed to champion freedom of speech, even despite that, how his great followers, Plato and Xenophon, wanted to remember him, wanted us to remember him, was as Socrates being not a man who was sad, not a man who was bitter, but a man who loved life and was, as Xenophon said, happy. When you look at Socrates' thoughts given to us by Plato, the word love appears more than any other. Socrates says, I do not remember a time when I was not in love with somebody. He says, love is the one thing I understand. And he also said, there is no point in living life unless you have a passion for who you are and what you do, unless you love the living of it. And so I'm just going to give you Socrates' final words to take with you for the rest of the evening. This is what he said during his trial. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner, and convincing him, saying, my friend, why do you, who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, why do you care up so much about laying money and honor and reputation as some kind of bank balance for yourself? Why do you care so little about wisdom and truth and the improvement of the soul? Please, live life better. So I would like you, ladies and gentlemen, to raise your glasses. There is no hemlock in it, I promise. We have not slipped a little phial of hemlock into anybody's cup as an archaeological experiment. There's only wine there. Because what I haven't shared with you is there is an extraordinary serendipity to me speaking tonight at this time, but Rosie doesn't know and Daisy doesn't know about, that on this very day, 2,410 years ago, at this precise time, so just as the sun was beginning to drop beneath the horizon, Socrates died. So I would like you to raise your glasses, and I propose, with my water, it's very Greek, I propose a toast to Socrates. So, to Socratic wisdom, to the power of philosophy, to the good life, and to the power of love. Thank you.